Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners. And first and always, thank you for listening. And this week, you called the subject, Clay, and I went, what? Really? Suicide? But it turned out to be very fascinating. We got some terrific insight from President Jefferson and talked about three specific cases that I find all of them fascinating.
I've been reading a new book called Creme Brulee about Jefferson in France with James Hemmings. James Hemmings was his slave, became one of the first French cooks in the history of the United States. Jefferson had him trained by a French master in Paris during those years and made a bargain with James Hemmings and said that if he came back and taught somebody else what he had learned, that Jefferson would free him. And he did. But we learned to our deep sadness that subsequently James Hemmings committed suicide in Baltimore, Maryland. And so that really sets off some kind of strange reflection and sadness about this whole story.
You know, all three of these instances,
Hamilton, Lewis, and James Hemmings.
They all have a bit of mystery around them that we could spend a great deal of time conversing about, not the least of which is Hamilton. We didn't talk a lot about him in the show, but whether or not he, as you put it, had a death wish, just how that all worked.
It's a strange thing. I've said this before, but Freudians, and I'm one of them within limits, say that, most of what's going on in us goes on below the radar of consciousness. And so Hamilton's son, Philip, is cut down in a duel defending his father at that very spot, I think around 18 months before Hamilton was killed. Then Hamilton is challenged by Burr. They go to the exact same dueling spot, and Hamilton is cut down in that duel and killed. You don't need to be a Freudian to see that there's something going on here. This is not mere coincidence. If his son had been killed in a duel over a woman or over a game of dice, that would be one thing. But his son was defending the reputation and character of his father, the highly controversial Alexander Hamilton, when he was killed. You can imagine how shattering that was for several different reasons for Alexander Hamilton. And then just, less than 2 years later, he's on the same spot, facing off against his inveterate enemy, Aaron Burr. There's a lot of psychological density to this story. We don't really know the answer to it, but there's clearly something more going on than mere coincidence. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, and then James Hemmings, we don't really know, I don't think, how he killed himself. But we do know that there was excessive drink involved in the weeks prior to his death. Jefferson
says so. We have to take him at his word on that, I suppose. We don't know. So anything could have happened. But there are intriguing parts of this. One is the bargain, that Jefferson made a bargain with Sally Hemings and with James Hemmings, and he kept his side of the bargain. Secondly, that James Hemmings understood under French law that he was free and confronted Jefferson. We learned this from the oral reports done by Sally Hemings' children late in life in Ohio, that there was a confrontation. And James and Sally Hemings, or James Hemmings, we're not sure if Sally Hemings was present that day, confronted Jefferson and said, explain exactly why we should go back to Virginia with you when under international law we're free. Why would we possibly voluntarily go back to re-enslave ourselves? And Jefferson said, to his credit, you're right, but I'll make this bargain with you. And the bargain seems a little weird, but the bargain was if you come back and teach somebody else what you've learned as a French chef, I'll manumit you in America. And Jefferson did it and gave James Hemmings startup money to go off to lead his life. And off he went. But what happened, we simply don't know. And that's the point I really want to make, David. We never really ever know the full story of a suicide, even when there's a suicide letter. In the case of Meriwether Lewis, no letter. But when Clark heard the news in Shelbyville, Kentucky, he got it from a public newspaper. He said, first of all, I fear the great weight of his mind has overcome him. But secondly, he wrote a letter to his brother Jonathan, and he said, I got a letter from Lewis a few weeks ago before he left St. Louis. That's an important letter. Save it. That letter has disappeared. We don't know what was in it.
Well, Jefferson wrote to a William William Evans in Baltimore. Evans wrote back saying, on November 5th, 1801, saying, "The report respecting James Hemmings having committed an act of suicide is true. I made every inquiry at the time this melancholy circumstance took place, the result of which was that he had been delirious for some days prior to committing the act, and it was the general opinion that drinking too freely was the cause." But beyond that, I couldn't find anything, how he killed himself, what happened.
Did he hang himself? Did he shoot himself?
Did he poison
drown
himself with alcohol?
So let me make one larger point, and then we'll go to the show. I have a book about this, the character of Meriwether Lewis.
We didn't bring that up in the show. I'm glad you are.
And there are 2 chapters about this very subject. One chapter is about the last days of Lewis's life, the last month after he left St. Louis until he died. And I try to follow all the evidence that we have about where he was and what's going on. And so that's a more factual chapter. The other chapter is called Why. It's the longest chapter of my book, The Character of Meriwether Lewis. I invite people to take a look at it. But I'll tell you what my conclusion is. It's this, that every one of us, you know this, David, and I know this, every one of us goes through the dark night of the soul. When that happens, if there is somebody there who loves us dearly and is willing to get us through that thing, that trough, that miasma, most people survive this. Lewis didn't have any of those things. Jefferson was in Virginia. Lewis's mother was in Virginia. His brother Reuben was on the upper Missouri. Clark had kind of moved on. Lewis had never married. His dog, I think, was gone by now, the famous Newfoundland dog Seaman. Lewis was not a religious person, so he didn't have a priest or a minister he could turn to. The dark night of the soul, he's alone, or he thought he was alone in the universe. If I say in my book, if Clark had been with him at that Frontier Hotel, Lewis would have lived, because Clark would have taken alcohol away from him or moderated it. He would have certainly taken gunpowder away from him. He would have stayed up all night with him and held his hand or watched over him or sipped wine with him. But it only takes a little to get you through, but you have to have that support structure, a friend, a lover, a spouse, a child. He had no children, even a pet. I say in my book, if the dog had been alive, Lewis probably would have survived, because he would have said, "You got to feed the dog. I have responsibility to the dog."
Before we do go to the show, I'm going to cut this short. We need your support. Go to jeffersonhour.com. If you are so inclined, you can join the 1776 Club and get all sorts of access to old shows.
Money makes the show go on, the show go on, the show go on.
I thought it was our dedication to doing this without...
We do it with or without money, but we could use the ranch.
Yeah.
You know?
So thanks very much, and we hope you enjoy this week's show. Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. Mr. Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author, Clay Jenkinson. I'm your host, David Swenson, and seated across from me is President Thomas Jefferson. So good to see you, sir.
Good day to you, citizen.
Mr. Jefferson, this week I've been asked to talk to you about a bit of a grim subject. That would be suicide. And particularly 3 episodes of suicide that involved individuals that you knew: Meriwether Lewis, James Hemmings, and perhaps Alexander Hamilton. But first, Mr. Jefferson, I'd like to ask you to share your thoughts about the causes of suicide. Now, we know that personal depression is often the root of suicide, and I know that, sir, you had your own experiences with this.
Well, just once, really. My wife, Martha, whom I married in 1772 and with whom I had 10 years of uncheckered happiness, Martha died on September 6, 1782 at Monticello. She was just 33 years old, and all of my prospects for the rest of my life, however long it should be, suddenly collapsed in an instant. I had young children. I made a commitment on her deathbed not to remarry. This was the most devastating blow of many losses and blows in the course of my long life. And during the weeks that followed, I think really for the only time, I wondered whether I could go on. I mean, sometimes it's not a question of choice. And I also wondered whether I really wanted to go on without her, with such a profound void at the center of my heart.
You wrote in a letter to Elizabeth Wales Epps, quote, "All my plans of comfort and happiness reversed by a single event, and nothing answering in prospect before me but a gloom unbrightened with one cheerful expectation." What did you mean by that, sir? And I do commend you for at least communicating with others about your state of mind.
Well, I was married, and when I married my wife, Martha, I expected it to last for the rest of my life, certainly for the rest of hers. I am not really a friend to the idea of second wives and so on. I belong to the school of sentimentalism, which was articulated in my time by Lawrence Stern in his books A Sentimental Journey and Tristram Shandy. The idea that a second wife could come in and replace the first was really anathema to me. And so of course, when I married my wife Martha, I expected that she would live a long and good life. And when she died at 33, I was just so broken down over this that I didn't know what to make of it. Now, in Virginia at the time, survivors remarried quickly. Meriwether Lewis's mother, for example, married less than a year after the death of her first husband, and that was more the norm. 6 weeks, 6 months, a year, possibly 2 years. That was the pattern because, of course, the death rate was so much higher in my time than it is in yours, and so much more labor was really needed to maintain a farm or plantation. But I just couldn't bring myself to do it, and so I looked at myself on the 7th of September, 1782. I was still a very young man, and I thought, well, now I could live 5 more years, 10 more years, 40 more years. I don't want to be alone without this woman that was the center of my existence. How does one really contemplate going on from that? And I couldn't really contemplate finding a second wife.
But you did go on. In that same letter you wrote, "This miserable kind of existence is really too burdensome to be borne. And were it not for the infidelity of deserting the sacred charge left me, I could not wish its continuance a moment," which tells us, sir, that you did recognize your duties, that you must not desert what you called your sacred charge.
Well, I was a father of young children who no longer had a mother. I was the patriarch of an extended family of cousins and nieces and nephews and so on. I had several hundred enslaved people that I was responsible for. I had plantations and crops and gardens and orchards and vineyards and livestock and a whole economic world, a small city really, to think about it in sort of larger economic terms. And so it wasn't that I could just take a boat to Europe and disappear into the world. I had very heavy responsibilities, and particularly the responsibilities of being a parent to my very young children. And so you move on. And let me say also that time is really the only answer to these things. When I wrote a letter of condolence to John Adams after the death of his wife Abigail, much later, I said, there's really nothing anybody can say that will help. Time is the only, it's not cure, but the only answer to this sort of grief. We go on. I found in my own life that the best thing to do was to get very busy indeed. I had written letters to my daughter Martha saying, "Determine never to be idle. He who never wastes a single moment will never complain about a want of time. That idleness begets ennui, and ennui begets nervous habits, and most of the neurotic episodes in life come from idleness. And so the answer to that is to become extraordinarily busy, to write letters, to read books, to graft orchards, to plant new varieties of pea or corn or wheat or whatever it might be, but to get active and by moving your body and employing your mind in productive activities, it's not that you solve these problems, because you don't. There will be moments when they crowd in on you, but it does at least give you a chance to get the time and stamina that are required for recovery.
But those who are doomed to this gloom unbrightened, sir, it's difficult to be self-aware enough to take the advice which you just gave us and you gave to your daughter. How did you do that, sir? Did you have individuals that you shared your burden with?
Not much, but I had my daughter Martha. So my daughter Martha was 9 years old at the time of her mother's death. So she was still a child, of course, and she was the eldest of my surviving children. But she grew up fast, let's put it that way. And she took it upon herself to watch over me. And, for example, she wrote letters and memoirs about this long after the fact, decades later, but said that for days and weeks on end, I wouldn't leave my room. I wouldn't see anybody. I broke down into periods of uncontrollable weeping, that I had food passed in without having to face anybody, that I slept on a pallet on the floor, that when I went out, I would ride my horses at breakneck speed through the countryside of the Blue Ridge Mountains. And she was cognizant of all this. It must have been horrifying to her, grieving for her mother as she was, watching out for her siblings, but also, in a certain sense, watching out for me. And she reported that when I would make these long rides, she would follow along on her mare, at some distance behind, respecting my privacy and my grief, but just to make sure that I would come home safely. And so what happened was that I formed a bond with her, born of this grief, that became, in some respects, the tightest, most powerful, most satisfying bond of my entire life. That it's not that she came to substitute in any way, of course not. She was my child. But she became the central figure of my heart for the rest of my life and helped to get me out from under myself. There's somebody else, my children, I had to look after. There are things that just have to get done, even on a plantation with lots of staff. And her solicitude, her deep concern for me was palpable. I recognized it. I was deeply grateful, of course, and I loved her more than I could have loved her had her mother lived. I know it sounds like a paradox, but that grief put us into a kind of intimacy that would probably have been much less likely had Martha, my wife, lived on for decades more.
Well, I understand that, Mr. Jefferson. I think I have to congratulate you, sir, on your strength of character. Not everyone has that strength of character, sir.
I should quickly say that Mr. Madison played a role here, too. So you asked how I got through it. Friendship, of course, books, the humanities, literature of grief. Literature is full of death,
so
dying.
Mr. Madison was there for you.
Of course, and he played the second most important role here. So he realized, as I think nobody else did, not even my daughter Martha, that as long as I were at Monticello, it would be less likely for me to recover relatively fast. And so he knew that Congress had been wanting me for a number of different years to go to Europe as a diplomat. And so he then made it known to the Congress of the United States that I might this time accept an offer to take on a diplomatic portfolio. Before I had been offered these chances and I had turned them down because of the fragility of my wife and my young family. And so he then said, I think if you ask Mr. Jefferson this time, he might accept. Congress asked me to go to Europe. I accepted, and I went in 1784 in July with my daughter Martha, my eldest child. I left the others back in Virginia with their aunt. And getting to Paris and to Europe, so far away from scenes of grief and death, had a ameliorative effect and helped to heal me.
So you're saying Mr. Madison helped to save you?
Oh, absolutely. This was one of the greatest acts of friendship that you could possibly imagine. He did it quietly. We never talked about it. We weren't the kind of people that would ever talk openly about such a thing. I didn't reveal the workings of my heart to anyone, really, in life.
But he knew you well enough to see this.
He sensed that I would recover more quickly if I went abroad. He knew that this would make me throw myself into my diplomatic duties. A sea change is often an essential part of emotional maturation.
Mr. Jefferson, we need to take a short break, but we'll return to this conversation in just a moment. You're listening to The Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to The Thomas Jefferson Hour. This week we're speaking with President Jefferson about suicide. And during our time, there is help available 24/7. One can call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-8255. Mr. Jefferson, we talked about you, and I have to note your strength of character in coming out of this, Mr. Jefferson, but not everyone had that strength of character, and a protege of yours, Meriwether Lewis, is an example of that. Could you speak about him, sir?
Yes, but let me say first that I do not judge those who take their own lives. I'm sorry they do. I think if people could get through these terribly dark moments, they probably could go on to lead a long and happy life. I always lament that people take such a desperate turn, but I don't judge them. I think that's a mistake. The Christian inheritance going back to St. Augustine condemns suicide as a terrible sin. I don't see it that way. But I'll say this. We spoke of my recovery, my daughter Martha, the fact that I was a father, the larger community at Monticello, Mr. Madison's intervention as a friend. When the dark moment came for Meriwether Lewis in 1808 and 1809 out in St. Louis, where I had posted him as the first governor of Upper Louisiana, he didn't have that support network. He didn't have anyone to help him through the darkness that he was enduring. His mother, Lucy, a friend of mine, was in Virginia in Albemarle County. His brother, Reuben, was up on the upper Missouri as a fur trader. He never married. He had never successfully been able to find a woman who wanted to share her life with him. His old friend William Clark was there, but Clark was busy with his own life. He had a young family and a young wife. There was a kind of there was no dispute, but there was a sort of inevitable structural separation that occurred as Clark began to enjoy all of the rituals of life as a married man and a father. And so Lewis was essentially alone, and he had lots of difficulties. He couldn't write his book. He had problems with his lieutenant, a man named Frederick Bates. He quarreled with the fur aristocrats of this very volatile frontier mix of Spanish, French, and American. He mishandled his own finances and to a certain degree mishandled his public finances. There were lots of things crowding in on Mr. Lewis, and he didn't really have anyone to turn to for support.
Yes, but you were quite impressed with this young man. Not only was he your personal secretary at the White House, but he also was your personal choice to lead this very important expedition. He's
an extraordinary young man, what we in the 18th century called a man of parts. He was a brilliant explorer. He had enormous physical stamina. He was so objective and accurate in his descriptions of plants and animals and meteorological events and so on that I said later you could assume that whatever he wrote was true, that it's as if you had seen those phenomena with your own eyes. He had a deep integrity. He had a kind of parental regard for the men that I had placed under his command. He was an extraordinary human being, a kind of a genius. But I had noticed he lived with me in the White House, in the president's house, for more than 2 years before he undertook his famous voyage. And I had noticed then, and later reported, that he was subject to hypochondriac moments what I called sensible depressions of mind. And I noticed that he drank too much, perhaps in reaction to his black moods, but the combination of alcohol plus depression can be a very stiff cocktail.
So even taking into account these things that you speak of, sir, you felt confident enough in his character to have him be in charge of the expedition, albeit shared.
Without question, and shared was his decision, not mine. When I named him the commander, the captain of the Corps of Northwestern Discovery, I expected it to be a sole command. He chose Clark.
Do you think then that his re-entry into the world, as you knew it, sir, after the expedition had something to do with his depression?
Maybe. We never talked about it. As I said earlier, I don't really talk in a deeply personal way with other people. I don't reveal much about myself. I don't ask them much about themselves. There's a certain kind of formal nature to my relations with others. I knew that he had enormous capacities as a writer, as an observer, as a leader. He had extraordinary wilderness skills. He knew something about the character of native peoples and was able to deal with them, I think, justly. And so I saw all these qualities in Mr. Lewis.
And yet he was only 35 years old when he died of gunshot wounds, apparently on a Tennessee trail. When you heard this, what was your reaction? There are those to this day who insist that Mr. Lewis did not take his own life, but that he was murdered.
I heard about this from his free black servant, a man named Pernia. And Pernia was with him at the time, did not witness the gunshot, the accident, but came. This was on the Natchez Trace, not so far from Nashville, Tennessee. When Pernia saw what had happened, he gathered Lewis's personal effects and hastened to Charlottesville and reported to Lewis's mother, Lucy, and to me what had happened. And I accepted his account. I never had reason to doubt it. Pernia was certain that Lewis had taken his own life with a gunshot wound to the head and another one to the belly or the abdomen. I suppose I would put it this way. I was shocked, but I was not terribly surprised because of the depressions that I had noticed and because of the drinking. And Lewis had ceased to communicate with the new president, Madison, with government entities back in Washington City in the federal capital, and he was very poor with this. He did not communicate well, and I grew exasperated because this was not optional, and I wanted his book to come out. The book would vindicate the expedition. The expedition had made really important discoveries in science, extraordinary relations with native peoples, vocabularies that he had taken down, soil samples, and I wanted this done. So something was going on out there, and I couldn't find out what it was, and I didn't have anyone on the ground who could help, and I wasn't able to supervise. But I will say I was frustrated with Mr. Lewis.
We know now, sir, that as you alluded to earlier, he drank too much.
I don't know that, but whenever you self-medicate with alcohol, you are exasperating others and increasing the difficulties that you face.
It compounds the situation.
Indeed.
And he was depressed. He was probably quite ill as well, although
malaria is what I've been told, and I had malaria. I mean, malaria was endemic in the New World.
And this causes bouts of dementia.
He was taking laudanum too, as I understand it, which is a tincture of opium plus alcohol. But I mean, we're making it seem as if he were a drug addict and a drunk. He was not. But he had an addiction. He had a susceptibility coupled with this deep depression. I don't ultimately know what it was, but I know that it bothered him that he couldn't find a wife. I know that it bothered him that he couldn't finish his book.
Also, he probably recognized that he had experienced the pinnacle of his life in the expedition and What was left for him?
He never said that, of course.
But it's a fair guess.
It's a fair guess.
Let's move on to another individual that you knew that chose suicide, and that was James Hemmings, an enslaved person of yours that went to Paris with you. Could you tell us what happened?
The Hemmings family, of course, had special status at Monticello. You all have heard of the famous Sally Hemings, but beyond that, the Hemmings were tightly bound into the world of my wife's plantation, the forest down near Williamsburg. John Wales, my wife's father, had buried several white wives, and then he took a black slave woman as his concubine and produced children by her. And so some of the slaves at Monticello, these were household servants, not field slaves, but they were related to my wife, Martha. And so they were lighter skinned. They had better clothing, better access, more amenities in life, a lighter workload.
In fact, Sally Hemings was your sister-in-law.
Probably, not certainly, but probably. So James Hemmings came with me. He was my valet, and he was a very young, intelligent fellow. And he went with my daughter Martha and me to Paris in 1784. And when we got to France, he learned French more quickly than I did. I knew French, but my French was written French. He knew none, but he came up to speed very quickly.
Very bright man.
Very bright young man. He actually took French lessons, paid fees to take lessons in the French language.
And it said that you saw an opportunity to gain a French chef for yourself.
So he had some talents in the kitchen, and so I thought I will apprentice him out, or I'll place him under a master French chef. He will learn the art of French cookery, and then when he comes back to Monticello, we can bring French cuisine to the Virginia frontier. And so I made this bargain with him that I would farm him out to a master French chef, and he would learn this and then come back and be able to cook in this style for me. And he did very well indeed. He had an enormous amount of freedom of movement in Paris.
So I'm trying to understand James Hemmings. Well, when he was in Paris, he was a free man.
Under international law, he was free.
And had he stayed there, he could have lived his life in Paris and remained a free man. But for whatever reason, you were able to talk him into coming back to the United States. And I'm wondering if years later he thought that was a mistake.
I don't know. Let me explain what happened. So I went with my daughter Martha and James Hemmings, and then later, after my youngest daughter died back in Virginia, Lucy, I insisted on my second daughter, Maria, coming to Paris to join us. I just couldn't stand the idea that she would be in the United States and we in Europe any longer. I wanted her under my own roof. I feared the worst of all things, that she might die and I would never see her again, or that the second worst, that she wouldn't even recognize us when we finally went back. And I asked that she be accompanied with a chaperone who was an elderly black woman who had had the smallpox. I actually had someone in mind. But they sent somebody else instead. They sent James Hemmings' sister, Sally Hemings, who was only about 14. She was not perhaps the ablest chaperone for a 9-year-old daughter of mine, but they made it across the Atlantic. They went to Britain. Abigail and John Adams welcomed them for a short time. Then they came to Paris. And so in Paris, James and Sally Hemings, who were brother and sister, were reunited. And then something happened. They came to me, I think this was James, and said, under international law in France, we are free. We have absolutely no requirement to go back with you. You can't make us go back. French law protects us. What are you going to do about this? And I knew they were right, that if they decided to stay in France, there's nothing I could have done to force them back to Virginia.
But it would have been a great personal loss and financial loss for you.
Yes, and might not have been the best thing for them either, but at any rate, I made a bargain with them. I said to James Hemmings, all right, I recognize this, that you are a human being and are entitled to be free, and here in France, the laws actually make you free, and I can't coerce you back to the United States, but here's the bargain I'll make with each of you. James, if you come back and spend enough time teaching somebody else at Monticello the art of French cookery, when I feel that you've satisfactorily done that and made an inventory of all the tools and kettles and pots and everything else that you need, spices and so on. I'll free you, and I'll even give you some startup money so that you can go to Philadelphia or Boston or wherever you might wish to go and live life as a free black man. And I said to his sister, Sally Hemings, if you agree to this and come back, then as you grow older, any children you have, I will free. At the age of 21, I will make sure that any children that you have are freed. And so they saw emancipation. They could come back for a kind of an apprenticeship period, that her children, she may never be free, but her children would, and that he would be free. And so this is what happened. We got back. I did free all 4 of Sally Hemings' surviving children. 2 I let walk away, and 2 I freed in the circumstances of my last will and testament.
Very good, Mr. Jefferson, but my question is do you think that Mr. Hemmings' decision to return from Europe had anything to do with the depression that led to him taking his own life?
I don't know. So he came back. He did teach his brother Peter Hemmings to be a French cook, and then I freed him. I gave him $30, which was a great deal of money at the time, and off he went, first to Philadelphia, and then he went back to France. I had nothing to do with that. He was in France for a time. He came back to the New World. He was here. He was planning to go to Spain.
It would be fair to say that drinking had something to do with this as well.
Well, let me say this, and I'm going to be very careful here, because it's going to sound as if I'm being defensive about slavery. But overnight freedom in a world that is not very generous towards African Americans is not necessarily the easiest thing to negotiate. And in some very, very, very limited sense, don't get me wrong, but in some very limited sense, James Hemings might have been better off with his actual kin at Monticello or nearby than going off into large American cities as a free black man on his own. I'm not suggesting that emancipation was a mistake. I'm just saying that there are psychological legacies of slavery that are going to play themselves out when people are freed.
And we shall never know. Before we end this part of our conversation, I want to go to the third gentleman I brought up, and that would be Alexander Hamilton. In his duel with Mr. Burr, it's generally agreed upon that Hamilton fired his weapon intentionally, fired first, and aimed to miss Burr.
That's what he said. He said his intentions were to miss, deliberately to miss. He had to fire. It wasn't a successful duel if you didn't actually fire. You couldn't just decline.
Well, looking at the eyewitness accounts, I think that's probably accurate, but Burr, on the other hand, shot to kill and did. There are those who would say that Mr. Hamilton knew this was happening and it was an intentional outcome for him.
You need to be really careful about trying to enter another person's consciousness. But let me say this. His son Philip had died in the same place in a duel protecting Alexander Hamilton's reputation a few months before this. And Hamilton was, of course, broken by the death of his son, not just the death of his son, but death as the champion of his father's reputation. And when Burr sort of pushed Hamilton towards the duel at Weehawken in July of 1804, Hamilton went knowing that his son had died on that very spot, planning to throw away his fire and not shoot to kill. He must have known that there was a distinct possibility that he would be killed. Burr did not have any compunctions about such things. I think Hamilton felt that his political usefulness was largely at an end. He had had a number of terrible setbacks in life. His son was dead. You know, it's at least possible that Hamilton went to New Jersey to those dueling grounds knowing that he might well be cut down. Now, whether that amounts to a death wish or suicide, I leave it to you to determine.
Well, sir, we shall never know. It is lost to history. I do thank you, Mr. Jefferson, for this conversation this week. Not one of our more pleasant ones, but very enlightening, and I thank you, sir.
It's an important conversation, and let me close the way I started by saying we should not judge people who take their own lives.
We're going to take a short break. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to The Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm Clay Jenkinson, out of character now. And across from me is my good friend and the semi-permanent guest host of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. David Swenson. Hello, friend.
Good to see you, sir. And I wanted to point out one more time before we continue. Difference between Jefferson's time and ours is there is help available 24/7 for people struggling with suicide. They can call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. The number is 1-800-273-8255.
You know, it's an important discussion. It came to me when I read a new account of Jefferson and James Hemings in Paris. And I think the question you asked today, which is, well, what is the best explanation we can make for James Hemings' subsequent suicide after Jefferson had freed him? I don't think we know the answer to that, but it's intriguing.
Well, we talked about three suicides that were close to Jefferson, people he knew. One being Meriwether Lewis, which I know you talk about in this week's essay. So
certainly a suicide.
But the other two, James Hemmings and Alexander Hamilton.
And I do think there is reason to believe that Hamilton had a kind of, I suppose you'd say, death wish.
Especially for those who are Hamilton lovers. I mean, it's a fascinating, the whole scene of it. And there's, there are eyewitness accounts, although some of them changed a bit.
And there are some, as usual, murky pieces of evidence. For example, Hamilton said he was throwing away his fire, but he had hair triggers set on the pistols. And so that doesn't seem quite right, but, we just don't know.
But wasn't it his doctor who attended to him after he'd been shot and was lying there? He warned the doctor that the other pistol was still loaded and it could go off.
Right.
And so he was recognizing that, which
we
is
don't
not
know.
the kind of thing that you would say if you were extremely upset because someone just shot you. There's something there. I don't know.
I think there's an in-between.
I'll
So
leave it there.
leaving suicide and death wish out, I think you could say that Hamilton didn't really want to fight the duel.
Well, I think that everyone would agree with.
And he didn't think that it was, he knew it was a bad idea. And he thought, well, it's often the case that two duelists can turn up in the dueling grounds and they can sort of deliberately miss each other, shake hands. They've shown that they are men of courage that stand up for their reputation and honor, but everyone is safe, no harm, no foul, and that's the end of it. And I think Hamilton looked on it that way, that I'll turn up because otherwise I'll be seen as a coward, but we'll both survive this. And I don't think that he counted on Burr being as ruthless as Burr turned out to be.
He should have, though.
He should have.
Yeah. Well, then we go on to Mr. Hemmings. And you think there's something in what I was asking him, that there was some, I mean, that whole line of conversation is so deep and can go on so long. But
you got to be so careful with this because you don't ever want to be in the position of saying, oh, he was better off as a slave, but he was better off with his kin, maybe. And so,
well, that's what I came to, is that he probably was talked into going back because he had family there.
He came back. So here's something I just learned this week getting ready for this show, is that Jefferson, when he became president, wanted a French chef in the White House, and he actually began to approach James Hemings and to offer him that position. If that had happened, this would be a completely different story, I think.
But he didn't want it.
Well, we don't know. Something didn't work out, and Jefferson wound up hiring a man named Honoré Julien instead. So, and then a few months later, James Hemings committed suicide. That's at least how Jefferson understood it.
There was a lot of back and forth. As Jefferson said he went back to Paris. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, it's strange that a free black man went back to France. He might have been in love in France. He might have loved France as a better, freer, less racist country.
And then he came back and he worked in Philadelphia
in Baltimore.
And Jefferson paid him like $30 for.
Well, when he freed James Hemings, he gave him $30, like startup money.
Okay, but he had to pay him when he was in Philadelphia.
Yes.
As well, because slavery was illegal in Philadelphia, right?
No.
It wasn't.
No, it wasn't. So Jefferson could go in and out of Philadelphia with no problem, but he often did pay his slaves wages when he took them away from Virginia. But the point I'm making is that Jefferson fulfilled his promise. He gave James Hemings the money to start off his own business as a caterer or a chef, and James went off to try to do it. and then something went terribly wrong. But here's what bothers me. The story of William Clark in York. So eventually, it's not clear that Clark ever freed York, but he allowed York to go live on his own. And then the story is later in life, it's the paper trail isn't solid, but later in life, Clark said York regretted that he'd ever gone off by himself. He wanted to come back and be my slave. I think white people probably spent a lot of time with that argument that they really missed us. They preferred slavery. They understood,
Right.
And I think we have to be exceedingly careful about buying that myth.
To me, there's this, we don't often think of the repercussions of the actions we take. A great example in tying it into suicide is war. I remember the morning it was announced that we were going into Iraq, pulling my car over and just shaking my head, being so disappointed in my country that we were going to do that. And part of my reasoning, call it naive or not, I don't think it is that it's not just the fortune of wars that is lost and wasted and squandered. It's not just the deaths and loss and lives wasted. It's those that survive and what happens to them. And we know now that the suicide rates amongst veterans from those wars is incredibly high. There's all these stories about veterans committing suicide in the parking lots of VA centers. It's that personal cost. And I guess I'm in a long roundabout way, help me clear this up. I know you will, is that we look at people like James Hemmings, and as you brought up York, and it's that same sort of, we don't know what effect it had on people to be enslaved.
Well, there's a PTSD, certainly, living a life of looking over your shoulder, being whipped for any signs of recalcitrance or uppityness, being forced to labor, sometimes being forced to breed, being bought and sold. I mean, unspeakable business, of course, and we don't know. I mean,
it's families being torn apart, too.
All the time. And
in war and in slavery.
In terms of war, that's one reason Jefferson was so anti-war.
You think?
Yes, but in our time, war is not summer camp. And so when the warriors come back from Afghanistan or Iraq or wherever, and maybe soon Iran, we're rattling our sabers at this moment, they don't come back and just effortlessly re-enter. Some do, most don't. So the PTSD is through the roof, domestic violence, drug addiction, alcoholism,
and not in all
suicide.
cases.
No, but it's through the roof.
It's there.
And what happens now, it's so hard to talk about, but so many people survive catastrophic wounds today because of our superior field medical attention that you see they come back, loss of limbs, permanent head injuries, blindness, a whole range of things, but they live, and the culture has a very hard time absorbing them by offering them jobs. We inadequately fund our veterans' hospitals. What happens is that the people who survive, many of them, are never going to fully reintegrate into American life because of sometimes profound physical and mental disabilities. Even those who have their limbs have seen things that make it almost impossible for them to lead normal lives. The fallout effect, we got into the habit after World War II of thinking they come back, they never talk about it again, and they have great lives. That's not the rule.
Well, let me end this because it's about time for this week's essay by going back to something we talked with Jefferson about in the first segment, and that is understanding. And I think people who have gone through personal tragedy have a little bit of a leg up on passing on understanding to others.
And I know you have, and I know
you
others
have as well.
And when this happens, you spend the rest of your life thinking, if I had called that person, if I had written him, if I could have, I should have seen it. I should have seen it coming.
Yeah.
Because it's such a shock. It creates a ripple effect, and the whole community has to think, why does this happen? Why does this happen?
Well, thank you very much, sir. And now it is time for this week's Jefferson Watch.
Thank you, David. Wherever I go to talk about the Lewis and Clark expedition, someone tries to talk me out of the idea that Meriwether Lewis committed suicide. The other day I was in Phoenix, and someone mansplained to me that Lewis could not have done it because how do you shoot yourself first in the head and then in the gut? Everywhere I go, people who have never held the kind of pistol Lewis was carrying give me lectures on forensics. He could not have survived a bullet to the head. He would have been so stunned from the first discharge of the pistol that he could never have reloaded and fired a second time. If you dug up his remains, you would find powder burns on the skull that would prove that he was murdered, and so on. Nobody has ever put forward the slightest piece of credible evidence that Lewis was murdered. They say the Natchez Trace was notorious for banditry, ergo he was murdered, that thugs associated with the traitorous General James Wilkinson wanted Lewis dead, that Jefferson himself may have had Lewis killed, or that Jefferson helped cover up the murder because it would have revealed unsavory things about his administration. One historian who knows better said that Lewis was flirting with the proprietor of the Frontier Inn where he was staying, Priscilla Grinder, and therefore her angry husband shot him. A woman named Kira Gale argued that documents seeming to confirm the suicide written by a Frontier friend of Lewis's, Captain Gilbert Russell, were actually forged. The most ingenious argument, arguably an insane one, was put forward by Lewis lover Thomas Denisi, who is an outstanding researcher but not much of a historian. He says that Lewis did indeed kill himself, but that he did not commit suicide. Lewis was in such physical pain from a virulent strain of malaria that he determined to end that pain forever with a 69 caliber aspirin, and therefore we should not call that suicide. Say what? Of course, it is possible that Lewis was murdered. It is also possible that somebody else killed Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman. It is possible that Apollo 11 never happened, and what we saw on TV 50 years ago this summer was shot on a Hollywood soundstage. All the evidence in the Meriwether Lewis case points to suicide, and none of it points to murder. His closest friend in the world, William Clark, someone who knew him better than anyone else alive, including Jefferson, on hearing the news wrote, "I fear, oh I fear, the weight of his mind has overcome him." Not, "No way. Whatever else was going badly in his life, I know that he wouldn't commit suicide." Or, "This just doesn't ring true. I'm going to start an investigation." No. Clark had seen Lewis about a month previously in St. Louis. He was filled with pity about Lewis's disturbed and distracted state of mind. When he got the news, he was shocked, but he was not surprised. Murder advocates say Clark may have believed this at the time in 1809, but later in life, on reflection, he became convinced that Lewis had been murdered. But this is mere wishful thinking. And here I thought we were historians who worked from evidence. President Jefferson never doubted that it was suicide. In fact, when he wrote the first biographical sketch of Lewis's life in 1813 for publication with the expedition's journals, Jefferson stated unequivocally that, quote, "about 3 o'clock in the night, he did the deed which plunged his friends into affliction and deprived his country of one of her most valued citizens." This is not the language of doubt, not. From the shadowy evidence we have, Lewis appears to have committed suicide. Or, while it seems likely that he committed suicide, I can assert, having known him intimately, that this was out of character, and therefore we must doubt. Nothing to qualify the simple acknowledgement by President Jefferson that Lewis took his own life. Why do we have such trouble facing what appears to be the obvious truth? I think there are two reasons. First, the social stigma attending to suicide continues to haunt our culture. Suicide is shocking. I have been close to several suicides in the course of my life. They shock and rock and roil the world around them like a big rock thrown into a placid pond. Close at hand, they are an emotional tsunami that overwhelms the people closest to the lost family member, spouse, or friend. Most people close to the suicide never really fully recover. And the concentric circles of that rock, the ripple effect, cause everyone within range to ask, what could I have done to prevent this? Suicide is a taboo because if we made it socially honorable, probably many more people in sudden intense misery would take their own lives. Second, lovers of the Lewis and Clark story cannot stand to think that one of the two great cheerful Boy Scouts who explored America between 1804 and 1806 was actually miserable and emotionally broken at the end of his short life. How can it be a heroic story if one of the two leaders put a gun to his head and pulled the trigger? To admit that Lewis committed suicide starts to call all sorts of things into question. Did Jefferson choose the wrong man to lead the expedition? How can this story be called triumphant and successful when just 3 years after it returned, its leader ended his own life? Did something happen out there? Is this a heart of darkness story in the manner of Joseph Conrad? Was Lewis's suicide some kind of preliminary commentary on the whole project of leaving home forever to take the country away from its aboriginal sovereigns? Or as the great essayist Barry Lopez asks, how far can you go out and still come back? It's just easier to think that some desperado saw that Governor Lewis was an important man carrying things of value and just killed him to get that stuff. Or that General Wilkinson, who was a dark, scheming, self-serving man, an actual traitor, had some reason to have Lewis killed. If Lewis was murdered, then nothing about his end can be seen to cast a shadow on the great epic journey. It's as if he completed a heroic mission and then 3 years later was hit by a bus. It's so much less psychologically messy that way, and we don't have to ask the hard questions and actually think about the incredible complexity of American history. It's the Thomas Denisi story that bothers me the most, that Lewis killed himself, but we don't have to call it suicide. This is what is known as saving appearances. Denisi is too good a historian to discount the obvious evidence before him, but he is too weak a lover of truth to accept it for what it is. So he exonerates Lewis from the shame and stigma of suicide, but without, like so many other so-called historians, tampering with the facts to suit his preconceived conclusion. What bothers me so much about this is that it is born of the same impulse to refuse to acknowledge that this great man, Meriwether Lewis, committed suicide and was suicidal on the night of October 11th, 1809, in a squalid frontier hut on the Natchez Trace, about 70 miles from Nashville, Tennessee. We need to destigmatize suicide. More than that, we need to learn to be tough enough to wrestle with the truth, for Lewis's suicide in 1809 is just one of the many, many hard truths we Americans are going to have to wrestle with and face courageously in the 21st century. I'm Clay Jenkinson.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public Radio. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author, Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any past show for a $12 donation, please call 888-828-2853. Again, that number is 888-828-2853. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.org and on iTunes. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.org. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Music by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson.